Nearly 50 years after a Fort Worth teenager's murder, a suspect is behind bars. And it's a man who had been on the radar the whole time.
Police in Fort Worth have arrested a man accused of abducting and killing then 17-year-old Carla Walker. According to detectives, DNA evidence has linked a suspect previously on their radar.
On a freezing Valentine's night in 1974, a 17-year-old girl was violently dragged from a parked car while her boyfriend lay bleeding and unconscious in the seat beside her. The last thing she said to him was a simple 4-word instruction, words he would carry heavily for the next 5 decades. 3 days later, her body was pulled from a lonely Texas culvert. The medical examiner revealed a devastating truth. She had been kept alive for 2 of those days, enduring unimaginable torture before she was strangled to death. That very same year, investigators sat directly across a table from the man who did it. He looked them in the eye, calmly answered every question, and easily passed a lie detector test. They let him go. For the next 46 years, he raised a family and grew old, living less than a mile from the crime scene. Welcome to Retrograde Crime, where we step into the past to uncover the truths hidden in the dark. Kindly subscribe to our channel and comment your country's flag below. Justice for this family didn't come from a government fund. It hinged entirely on a television network writing a $15,000 check, a forensic lab making a phone call on the 4th of July, and a veteran detective hearing a name he recognized from a file he had carried for half a century. Her name was Carla Jan Walker. Born on January 31, 1957, in Fort Worth, Texas, she was the 4th of 5 children raised by Leighton and Doris Walker. At 17 years old, she was a junior at Western Hills High School, the kind of person who made a room feel slightly warmer the moment she walked into it. Standing just 4 feet 11 inches tall, weighing a slight 110 pounds, and crowned with a thick mane of honey blonde hair, she didn't look like an immovable force. But her family had one specific word for her: Spitfire. She was fiery, stubborn, and utterly certain of who she was. When she was 15, she told her parents she wanted a brand new Monte Carlo for her birthday. When they told her no, she didn't argue or throw a tantrum. She simply stated that she didn't want anything else at all. They bought her the Monte Carlo. Carla was a cheerleader and a tennis player. She was the girl who smiled at everyone she passed in the corridors, greeting them by name, somehow managing to be the person who took up the most space in a room, not loudly, but completely. Her 12-year-old brother, Jim, looked at her and saw a future veterinarian. Her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, looked at her and saw his entire life. He had already given her a promise ring. They talked constantly about going to Texas Tech University together after graduation. Carla had no doubt about any of it. Her future was a mapped-out, beautiful certainty. February 17, 1974, was a Sunday, the night of the Western Hills High School Valentine's dance. It was an evening Carla and Rodney had been looking forward to all week. Rodney, an 18-year-old senior and the quarterback of the school's football team, had borrowed his mother's Ford LTD for the occasion. He cleaned it up, polished it, and drove over to pick Carla up at the Walker home. The dance was everything a high school dance in the 1970s was supposed to be. When it ended, neither of them was ready for the magic of the evening to stop. They cruised the main boulevard the way Fort Worth teenagers did back then. Windows rolled down, music playing, with no particular destination in mind. Rodney would say later, "I was having such a good time, I didn't even care what time it was." Their last stop of the night was the Brunswick Ridglea Bowl, a neighborhood bowling alley. It was a familiar, safe, and close-by spot. Carla needed to use the restroom before Rodney took her home, so he pulled into the parking lot. The lot was completely empty when they arrived, a detail that gave neither of them any reason to feel alarmed. Suddenly, the passenger door flew open. A man stood outside in the dark, leveling a gun directly at Rodney's face. Before Rodney could process the threat, or the man's demands to kill him, a heavy object struck him violently across the head. The world instantly went dark. In that final, fractured moment before he slipped into unconsciousness, he didn't hear a blood-curdling scream, or panicked weeping. He heard a direct instruction. Carla looked at him and said 4 words. "Rodney, go get my dad." It was a directive from a 17-year-old girl, still trying to find a way out of an impossible situation. Then there was only silence. Rodney was left alone in the dark parking lot of a bowling alley on Valentine's night, blood running down his face, and Carla Walker was gone. Rodney finally regained consciousness around 1 a.m. Dazed, severely concussed, and bleeding profusely from his head wounds, he put the Ford LTD into gear and drove straight to the Walker residence, less than a mile away. He didn't even take the time to park in the driveway. In a blind panic, he drove straight over the curb, tearing across the front lawn before slamming on the brakes. Inside the house, Leighton and Doris Walker were still awake, sitting in the dining room playing dominoes with visiting relatives. In the living room, 12-year-old Jim and his 18-year-old sister Cindy were winding down in front of the television. The quiet of the night was shattered by a frantic, heavy pounding on the front door. When they opened it, they found Rodney. He was a horrific sight, his face and shirt completely soaked in blood, his body shaking, and his speech barely coherent. He gripped the door frame tightly just to stay upright, looked at Carla's father, and gasped out the words that would change their family forever. "Mr. Walker, they've got her. They're going to hurt her bad." Leighton Walker, a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel, didn't hesitate. He grabbed his personal pistol, ran to his car, and sped out into the darkness toward the Ridglea Bowl. Behind him in the house, Doris picked up the rotary phone with trembling fingers and dialed the police. When Leighton arrived at the bowling alley, the parking lot was empty. There was no sign of his daughter. The only things left behind to mark the violence of the night were Carla's purse lying abandoned on the cold pavement, and beside it, a .22 Ruger magazine clip that had fallen from the attacker's gun during the struggle. The trap had closed, the countdown had begun, and Carla was officially missing in the dark. 3 days passed, each one heavier than the last. The Walker family lived in that suspended state that has no name, not grieving yet, because grieving requires certainty, but completely unable to breathe. Every morning during those 3 excruciating days, Doris Walker walked to Carla's photograph on the wall and said good morning to it. A devastating ritual she would continue every remaining morning of her life. Her 12-year-old brother, Jim, simply waited. He had no framework for what was happening, no adult language, and no category for a beloved sister who had gone out for a high school dance and simply never came back. On February 20th, 1974, the agonizing waiting came to a brutal end. Carla Jan Walker's body was found discarded in a concrete culvert on Pearl Ranch Road near Benbrook Lake, roughly 30 minutes south of Fort Worth. She was still wearing her beautiful dress from Valentine's night. The medical examiner's report laid out the nightmare in plain, horrific terms. Carla had been kept alive for 2 full days after her abduction. In those 48 hours, while her family searched, and her father drove to every empty parking lot he could reach in the dark, Carla was breathing. She was beaten, tortured, raped, injected with morphine, and finally strangled to death. At the scene and during the autopsy, investigators meticulously collected Carla's clothing and biological samples. They knew this material contained the attacker's identity. But 1974 was an era of profound scientific limitation. There was no national database, no DNA profiling, and no method to convert a crime scene sample into a suspect's name. The samples were carefully logged, sealed, and stored in the Fort Worth Police Department evidence room, where they would sit undisturbed in the dark for the next 46 years. What detectives could work with immediately was the physical evidence left in the bowling alley parking lot, the dropped magazine clip. It belonged to a highly specific weapon, a .22 caliber Ruger pistol. Investigators began pulling handgun sales records across the entire city of Fort Worth, looking for anyone who had recently purchased that exact model. One name leaped off the pages, a 30-year-old truck driver named Glen Samuel McCurley. McCurley didn't just own the right gun. He held a prior criminal conviction for car theft, lived less than a single mile from the Ridglea Bowl, and had been off work the exact day of the murder. Furthermore, his wife was out of town. Detectives walked up to his porch and knocked on his door. When investigators came calling, McCurley didn't run, panic, or get defensive. He was perfectly calm, polite, and cooperative. He had a smooth explanation ready for every single question. The Ruger pistol? He claimed it had been stolen right out of his truck 6 weeks before the murder. He explained he hadn't reported the theft simply because he was a convicted felon and had no desire to attract police attention to his home. His whereabouts on Valentine's night? He claimed he was home alone while his wife was visiting family in West Texas. Hoping to clear his name entirely, McCurley readily agreed to take a polygraph test. He sat still in the station chair, wires wrapped around his chest, answering every question without a single tremor in his voice. The polygraph machine processed his physiological responses and returned its definitive verdict. He was telling the truth. The system believed the machine. Investigators crossed Glen Samuel McCurley's name off the suspect list, closed his folder, and let him walk right out the front doors of the station. He drove home to his house, less than a mile from where he had torn Carla out of her boyfriend's arms, and quietly returned to his life. What investigators completely failed to realize in 1974 was the dark significance of the date. February 17th was McCurley's 11th wedding anniversary. His wife and children were away in West Texas, leaving him entirely unsupervised. He had clocked out of his truck driving shift at 4:30 p.m. that afternoon, and had been heavily drinking whiskey and beer for hours before driving out into the Fort Worth night to go hunting. Because a primitive machine misread his pulse, McCurley got to watch his own children grow up, graduate, and live their lives, a future he had violently stolen from Carla's parents. He became, by all outward appearances, an ordinary, decent neighbor. Years later, a local woman even wrote a glowing letter to the city newspaper, publicly praising McCurley for tracking her down to return a lost wallet she had dropped, writing that the world needs more folks like this. The machine said he was an honest man. The neighborhood thought he was a good citizen. They were all dead wrong. Carla's family spent decades suffering in silence while her killer lived down the street. If you have the heart to help make sure stories like hers are never forgotten, hit subscribe right now. Don't let their names fade into the dark. With McCurley cleared, the case files were placed on a shelf, and the dust began to settle. Decades of agonizing silence were about to begin for the Walker family, entirely unaware that the monster they were looking for was passing them in local traffic year after year. As a retired Air Force officer, he was a man built on discipline and order, suddenly confronted with a horrific, chaotic problem that defied resolution. He and Doris spent the rest of their days living under the crushing weight of an open investigation, their only solace being the portrait of their beautiful daughter hanging on the dining room wall. Their son, Jim Walker, grew from a helpless 12-year-old boy into a grown man carrying what he later described as a profound, silent anger. It was a burning rage fueled by the agonizing void of not knowing who had done this to his sister. Year after year, decade after decade, Jim cooperated with every single reporter who called, and every new investigator who knocked on his door. He worked tirelessly with the only tools he had at his disposal: sheer persistence and an absolute refusal to let Carla be forgotten. But time is cruel. Leighton Walker eventually passed away without ever hearing the name of the man who had destroyed his family. Doris died later, wrapped in the exact same unresolved grief. Neither of them ever knew that the man who had brutally taken their daughter had never actually left Fort Worth. He had likely passed them in traffic, stood in line behind them at the grocery store, and lived out his life across the span of 46 years in their own backyard. Jim was left to bury both of his parents without ever being able to give them an answer. The ripples of that Valentine's night reached far beyond the Walker household. Rodney McCoy, carrying the physical scars of the ambush and the psychological trauma of losing Carla, found that he simply could not stay in the city. The memories haunted every street corner. Seeking an escape, he moved as far away as possible, all the way to Alaska. It was a place cold enough, distant enough, and different enough that nothing could remind him of Fort Worth, or parking lots, or the darkness of that night. He built a new life there, married, and raised children. By all outward appearances, he was someone who had successfully moved on, but deep down, he continued to carry those 4 final words through every single day of his life. Meanwhile, Glen Samuel McCurley lived in plain sight. He watched his own children grow up, celebrated holidays, and enjoyed the quiet peace of retirement. The contrast was staggering. An innocent family frozen in a perpetual state of grief, while the monster responsible experienced the full, unhurried trajectory of a normal human life, less than a mile from the Brunswick Ridglea Bowl. Then, in April 2019, a cold case detective digging through the mountain of original 1974 paperwork pulled out a document that had been overlooked for decades. It was an anonymous, cryptic letter written the same year as the murder. The handwriting was shaky, but the message was chillingly direct. It read, "Kill Carla Walker in Benbrook." It wasn't signed with a name, a set of initials, or a location. Instead, the author had concluded the message with a highly unusual, specific sequence of binary numbers. Realizing the potential significance of this long-buried clue, The Fort Worth Police Department took a modern gamble. They photographed the letter and posted it across social media platforms for the very first time in 45 years. They hoped against hope that the unique structure of the binary code or the distinct slant of the handwriting might trigger a memory for someone out there.
The writing.
A whisper from the past could bring long-sought answers.
Trying to find who wrote this letter and...
The letter was written in 1974 and rediscovered when new detectives took over the case. It lists a suspect name police have blanked out.
Kill Carla Walker in Benbrook. P.S. It is hard to say, but it is true.
They needed a whisper from the past to finally wake the case up. When the police department posted the letter, the local media picked it up, and the digital world began to buzz with theories. True crime enthusiasts analyzed the binary sequence, and community members shared the post thousands of times. Jim Walker, true to form, responded to this sudden development the same way he had responded to every lead for nearly half a century, with a stubborn, resilient hope. He publicly stated to reporters that he felt the hand of God moving in the timing of the discovery, expressing an absolute certainty that this bizarre letter would be the catalyst that finally solved his sister's murder. He believed with every fiber of his being that the writer had eventually dropped a hint to someone else, and that all law enforcement needed was one single phone call from a person brave enough to recognize that specific thought process.
He said something to somebody. Somebody's going to recognize that type of thought process in writing, and that's all we need is a phone call.
The strategy worked. The viral nature of the anonymous letter didn't just generate standard community tips, it attracted a wave of national attention. That localized digital noise slowly began to ripple outward, eventually landing on the desk of people with the exact technology needed to break a 46-year silence. In April 2020, a national true crime television program aired an episode dedicated entirely to Carla's case. The broadcast caught the attention of a veteran investigator who recognized that conventional police methods had exhausted every available option. He immediately connected the Fort Worth detectives with a specialized private forensic laboratory located in the Woodlands, Texas. This facility wasn't like standard state labs. It had been custom-built for one highly specific purpose: extracting and rebuilding usable DNA profiles from severely degraded, minuscule biological evidence that traditional testing methods deemed completely unreadable. The television network stepped in to fund the endeavor, writing a check for exactly $15,000. That single dollar amount was the only barrier standing between the Walker family and a 46-year-old truth. The stakes inside the laboratory were extraordinarily high. What the public didn't realize was that multiple previous forensic attempts over the decades had nearly consumed everything left of the original crime scene samples. The National DNA Database, CODIS, had returned absolutely nothing. A standard Texas genealogy lab had also failed, yielding no matches. Every single failed attempt had whittled away at the finite biological material harvested during the 1974 autopsy. By the time the evidence vials arrived at the private facility, there was barely enough material left for one final, definitive analysis. This was law enforcement's absolute last shot. The scientists utilized advanced genome sequencing technology, originally developed for cutting-edge biomedical research. Step by step, they successfully bypassed the degradation of the decades-old material, meticulously reconstructing a complete, pristine DNA profile from what the previous labs had left behind. Once the profile was finalized, they uploaded the data to GEDmatch, a massive public genealogy database, and began the grueling process of mapping familial relationships. The digital search algorithm combed through millions of profiles before finally returning a hit. It wasn't a direct match to a killer, but it was a link to a distant relative. By tracing the branches of that relative's family tree backward and forward through public records, genetic genealogists isolated a single, specific surname. On the morning of July 4, 2020, the CEO of the forensic lab picked up the phone and dialed Fort Worth detective Jeff Bennett. He delivered the breakthrough news. They had successfully mapped the crime scene DNA to a specific family tree, and the last name was McCurley. Detective Bennett immediately reached across his desk for his investigative binder. The thick, running historical record of every single lead, dead end, interview, and name that had surfaced and faded since Valentine's night in 1974. He flipped through the faded pages until his eyes landed on a specific entry from 46 years prior. Bennett took a sharp breath. He asked the lab director a direct question. Is there anyone in that specific family tree named Glen Samuel McCurley? The lab director stated he would need to double-check the mapped names. He hung up the phone, reviewed the genealogical data, and called the detective right back. There was Glen Samuel McCurley Jr., residing right there in Fort Worth, and present in the city at the exact time of Carla's murder. Detective Bennett later testified that the entire atmosphere of the room shifted in that exact second. For nearly half a century, generations of detectives had prayed to hear the one true name that would unlock the file. The right suspect from 1974, originally cleared because a primitive machine took his word for it, had just been trapped by a modern machine that did not care about his lies. However, genetic genealogy alone is not legally sufficient to secure an arrest warrant. Law enforcement still required direct, undeniable biological confirmation from the suspect himself. In July 2020, undercover investigators initiated a surveillance operation on McCurley's neighborhood. They waited until the evening trash collection, quietly seizing the household rubbish bags McCurley had left out on the public street. Because items discarded on a public curb hold no legal privacy protections, the bags were legally rushed straight to a forensic laboratory. The results were instantaneous. The DNA recovered from the items inside McCurley's trash perfectly matched the DNA preserved on Carla's clothing. To ensure the case was completely airtight before moving to an indictment, investigators directly approached McCurley at his home, asking him to voluntarily provide a standard cheek swab. Still projecting the same calm, cooperative demeanor he had used in 1974, McCurley agreed and let them take the sample. The cheek swab matched the trash. The cheek swab matched the clothing. 3 completely independent biological samples, all pointing directly to one single man. Mathematically, the probability that the material on Carla's clothing belonged to anyone other than Glen Samuel McCurley was calculated at an astronomical 1 in 28 octillion. On September 21, 2020, 46 years after he walked out of his first police interview, the handcuffs finally clicked around McCurley's wrists. Inside the interrogation room in September 2020, Glen Samuel McCurley sat across from a new generation of detectives. Just as he had done 46 years prior, he looked them in the eye and denied everything. He claimed he knew absolutely nothing about the abduction, that he had never been to the bowling alley, and that he was completely innocent. But detectives didn't have to rely on a polygraph machine this time. They had a 1 in 28 octillion DNA match sitting on the table between them.
Tell me the truth, but right now you're not giving me the truth.
I did not kill anybody.
Then what did you do? What did you do if you did not tell me? Give me something. Give me something that makes me believe you're not the monster.
Then, question by question, as detectives methodically laid out the genetic evidence, McCurley's defiant facade began to fracture. His account of that night slowly began to shift. He finally admitted to drinking heavily on Valentine's night in 1974, consuming whiskey and beer for hours after his shift ended at 4:30 p.m. He admitted he spent the night driving aimlessly around Fort Worth in the dark, parking his truck in various lots, hunting for a target. Carla Walker had not been followed or chosen because of who she was. She was simply an innocent teenager who happened to be in the wrong parking lot on the exact night a monster decided to stop driving. Following a wave of rationalizations and tears, McCurley finally muttered the confession detectives had waited nearly half a century to hear. "I did do it, I guess." When asked why he didn't just let her go after the abduction, his response was chillingly cold. He was simply afraid she would report him to the police. Armed with a full confession, investigators executed a search warrant on McCurley's home. Hidden inside the house, they discovered the exact .22 caliber Ruger pistol that McCurley had claimed was stolen from his truck 6 weeks before the murder. Through the entire 1974 investigation, through the decades of the Walker family's agonizing silence, and through the deaths of Carla's parents, the murder weapon had sat quietly inside his house the entire time. The machine in 1974 had said he was honest. The hidden gun proved otherwise. McCurley's murder trial opened in August 2021. Despite his recorded confession, he initially pleaded not guilty, forcing Carla's surviving family to sit through 2 grueling days of horrific forensic testimony. But on the morning of day 3, as the weight of the evidence became entirely overwhelming, McCurley abruptly changed his plea. He stood before the judge and uttered a single word: guilty. During the victim impact statements, Carla's older sister, Cindy Stone, stood up and walked to the podium. She didn't use notes. She looked directly at the elderly, cancer-stricken man who had lived as their neighbor for 46 years and spoke with absolute authority.
I wish you had done this a long time ago. I want to know if you've done this to anybody else, you need to bring that out because those families need to know too.
An arrest warrant.
McCurley gave her nothing but silence. The judge sentenced Glen Samuel McCurley to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When reporters later asked the 78-year-old killer why he had suddenly changed his plea on day 3 of the trial, his answer showed zero remorse or guilt. He simply muttered, "I have suffered enough." He had enjoyed 47 years of absolute freedom. 2 days of facing his own actions in a courtroom was what he considered suffering. The closure for the Walker family was life-changing, but for law enforcement, the wider file remained open. Detectives firmly believed McCurley was a serial predator and aggressively pressed him on at least 3 other unsolved murders of young women in the Fort Worth area during the 1970s and 80s. McCurley denied those crimes until his final breath, taking whatever dark secrets he possessed to the grave when he died behind bars in July 2023. While McCurley took his secrets with him, the legacy of Carla Walker's case completely revolutionized American justice. The forensic genetic genealogy method utilized by the private lab successfully survived a rigorous Daubert hearing, establishing a monumental legal precedent that officially cleared the threshold for advanced DNA admissibility in a court of law. Furthermore, federal legislation known as the Carla Walker Act was proposed to create dedicated government funding, ensuring that future law enforcement agencies would never have to depend on private money or television networks just to fund the DNA testing required to solve a cold case. On Valentine's night in 1974, Carla Jan Walker used her final moments of freedom to protect the person she loved, telling him to go get her father. 46 years later, the man who stole her life finally stood in a courtroom and admitted his guilt. Justice arrived late, and it arrived incomplete, but for the Spitfire of Western Hills High School, it finally arrived. Every cold case we uncover on this channel represents a real life, a real family, and a story that deserves to be remembered. If you believe that time shouldn't dictate whether a victim gets justice, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to Retrograde Crime. It tells the algorithm that these cases still matter, and it keeps us digging into the archives. Before you go, drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts on how this investigation unfolded. 1. What do you think is the biggest flaw in our justice system when a killer can pass a polygraph and live less than a mile from the crime scene for 46 years? 2. How do you feel about the fact that this case was only solved because a television network wrote a check, rather than through government investigative funds? 3. Do you believe Glen Samuel McCurley was responsible for the other unsolved murders in Fort Worth? Or did he truly only strike once? I read every single comment. Let's talk in the section below.